Hi everyone, welcome to today's lecture. Today we're going to continue to talk about persuasion, but I'm going to introduce you to the theory of social judgment. It's another theory that can help us better understand the process of persuasion and just give us a few additional tools to put in our tool belt when we may be attempting to influence someone or when perhaps someone is trying to influence us. Before I start talking about the theory though, I wanted to take a moment to review one of my very favorite quotes from your reading. At the start of the chapter on liking, Cialdini says, "It is useless to attempt to reason a man out of a thing he was never reasoned into." I love that quote, and let me tell you a few reasons why. I think that for whatever reasons, as we are kind of growing up and as we are learning about communication and persuasion, somehow we kind of come to have this idea that the best way to persuade someone is to state our case, figure out our argument and state our case, and then collect as many facts and pieces of evidence and arguments as we can and throw all that at the person that we're trying to persuade. And that somehow automatically the person will be won over by our evidence and our logic, and we will be able to successfully persuade them with that logos, as Aristotle would say. But I think Cialdini does a great job of pointing out that, sometimes that just doesn't work that way, right? You were reading about scientists trying to convince the American population in evolution. And what you found was no matter what those scientists said, people were not going to buy it, right? Instead, they were persuaded by George Clooney and Emma Watson, right? So as we are starting our conversation here regarding social judgment theory, I just really want you to maybe keep that quote in the back of your mind and recognize that there are lots of different routes to persuasion. Right? Last week we talked about elaboration likelihood model, and we talked about that central route processing versus the peripheral route processing. Your reading, really kind of focuses on those influence levers or those click run processes that are kind of within the peripheral processing route. But social judgment offers us another explanation. And again, I hope at the end of this lecture you feel like you just simply have more tools in your tool belt when it comes to thinking about how you can influence others. So the game plan today is to basically, talk about the overarching idea of social judgment theory and identify some of its key components. So I hope by the end of the lecture you understand these concepts of different attitude zones, you're familiar with the term ego involvement, and you also understand some of the biases that we might have when we are attempting to process persuasive messages. My hope also is that I will be able to share with you lots of real life examples of how we can see social judgment theory being able to explain when persuasion is effective and not. But I hope you also can think of some examples on your own as you are listening to this lecture from your life that can be applied. Okay. All right, so with that being said, let's jump in here. Social judgment theory was developed in the 1960s, and it originated from an interesting question. Right? The question essentially asked, how is it that people can watch the same message and yet have completely different reactions to that message? Sheriff, and Nebergall, when they did some experiments on this, they actually exposed participants to a message that said, "You are getting ready to win a car." And what they found was even with news like that, people responded differently. Very affluent individuals, right, who already owned luxury vehicles were less than thrilled, right? They didn't really care. On the other hand, other individuals were excited, but were very concerned about insurance and how they were going to pay like the future costs that were associated with the car. Right? On the other hand, some people just took it at face value and were pumped to hear they were going to win a car. So they found this really perplexing and really interesting, right? How can we see the same message yet react differently? You can see on my slide here, I just have a screenshot of the New York Times. And you can see one of the articles that is currently being discussed is an article about the FDA delaying the COVID vaccine for children under 5. Now, we could all sit down, all 8 members of the class and myself, and read this article And my hunch is afterwards, if we discussed it, we would find lots of different opinions and lots of different reactions to what we read. Some of you might read an article like that and say, well, thank goodness the FDA is taking their time. They need to get this right. There's lots of questions that should be answered, and so it's not a problem. It's a good thing to have delays. Some of you may read the article and be frustrated that there continue to be delays and see those as unnecessary obstacles. And then some of you may be somewhere in between. So the theory basically attempts to, again, answer this question. Why do we have different reactions to the same message? Here's the answer they come up with. Okay. The theorists argue what happens anytime we are exposed to a new message, particularly one that's a persuasive message or something trying to influence us. We take that message and we compare it to our current attitudes. So, in other words, any new message that we hear is not just a message that exists in a vacuum or separate from people's perceptions. Rather, we take in this new data, but we are comparing it to what we already feel about an issue. You probably have not already done the exercise for this module, or maybe you have. But you'll find that there is a video for a kid's scientific experiment that involves dipping your hand into different temperatures of water. I think that experiment is a great visual for this concept that I'm just discussing. The idea that when we take in new messages, we compare the new data to our existing attitudes. What you'll see happen in that video is exactly that process. Okay, so the theory goes on to explain what our attitudes might look like. Right? Social judgment says that people tend to have attitudes that fall along a continuum. Right? And so I want to talk about these different components of this continuum. So first we have the concept of latitude of acceptance. Your latitude of acceptance is your range of statements that you can hear about an issue that you would tend to agree with, that seem acceptable to you. Right? Within that, we tend to have an anchor attitude. Your anchor attitude is the statement that you most specifically agree with, that really, truly matches your opinion on an issue. And I should say here, I'm going to give you some definitions for each of these, but then we'll see some examples here in a moment. So regardless of the topic, whether it is the price of a new car or the delay of a COVID vaccination, this theory argues we tend to have a latitude of acceptance regarding the issue, right? A range of statements that we tend to agree with. On the other hand, however, the theory also says we tend to have a latitude of rejection. Within our latitude of rejection are statements that we do not agree with, right? That we reject, that we find false, right? Or we find contradict our beliefs. And you can see that visually on the chart below. And then finally, social judgment says we have this latitude of non-commitment. So there may be some statements regarding an issue that we don't really agree or disagree with, that we are kind of ambivalent about, and we maybe don't have an opinion on. It might be because of a lack of information, or it might be a lack of interest, but there just are simply some ideas regarding a particular issue that we're not committed to. We're not in agreement or disagreement with. Okay, so that's a definition of all these different components with which our attitudes can kind of fall. But let me show you a picture now that provides you with like a more specific example. All right, so I'm going to be honest with you. I pulled this off the internet, and this particular issue deals with what should be done with murderers. So we have kind of this intense issue, right? With an issue like that, certainly there are lots of different viewpoints that people might have, right? You know, it's hard to imagine that someone would feel like we should reward a murderer, but we can see that that might be one extreme stance on this issue. As we kind of work our way down what we can call this continuum, you can see that we have a variety of additional stances on the issue, all the way down to kind of the opposite extreme here at the bottom, What should we do with murderers? They should be put to death by torture, right? So here we have this kind of intense issue, and we have represented on the slide here a variety of viewpoints or stances that you might have on the issue. I should use the language of the theory. We have a variety of attitudes about this issue, right? Now, next to all these different attitudes, you can see here a visual of how these two different people feel, right? Again, I pulled this right from the internet, right? So I kind of chuckled when I saw these names, right? First of all, you can see Muffy. You can see that her anchor position is represented by this X. So the position that she feels most strongly about would be that if you kill someone, you should spend life in prison without parole. Right? However, what she says is she actually could also kind of agree with the possibility that murderers do deserve the death penalty. Right? That's an issue that falls with, or an attitude that falls within her latitude of acceptance. On the other hand, we can see she has a pretty broad latitude of rejection. Anything less than 20 years in prison is something that she would object to. Right? In addition, she would object to torturing murderers to death. Okay. On the other hand, we can see that Moore has similar yet different attitudes about what we should do with murderers. Right? They actually have kind of the same anchor position here, but their latitude of acceptance is a little different, right? He might find it agreeable that someone who kills someone might be granted life with parole, right? He is suggesting that that is an option that might seem acceptable to him. Right? He's got a larger latitude of non-commitment as well, which then we can also see kind of ultimately leads to smaller latitude of rejection than Muffy. Although they both disagree or do not have the attitude that death by torture would be acceptable or anything less than a $500 fine would be acceptable. Okay. So now let me just kind of bring it full circle here, right? Now that we hopefully better understand these different attitudes and those key concepts of the theory. Remember, the theory says people have different reactions to the same message, or in this case, the same issue, because what they're doing is they are comparing new info and new data to their existing attitudes. And so with that being said, we can go on to this next part here and say, so what people do is when they hear a persuasive message, they compare that message to their existing belief. That sometimes leads to some different biases. First, we have the contrast effect. The contrast effect occurs when someone hears a message that falls into their latitude of rejection, so a statement that they disagree with, and they hear that message as being even farther away from their anchor position than what it really is. So let me give you an example here, right? Let's imagine we are talking about an issue of student loan forgiveness. Maybe that's an issue that is important to all of you and an issue that you have attitudes or opinions about, right? And so perhaps I say something like, you should not have your student loan, you shouldn't have your student loans forgiven unless you work in a nonprofit organization for at least 5 years. If you feel, or if that statement falls into your latitude of rejection, and you feel that maybe college should be free, that we shouldn't even have to mess with student loans, the contrast effect would occur if you heard me say something like, you thought that I was saying, no, we should never forgive student loans, right? So what I said was, we should only forgive student loans if you work in a nonprofit for 5 years, right? I didn't say that student loans should never be forgiven, but because that message fell into your latitude of rejection, you didn't really like that message or agree with it, you felt that I was disagreeing with you even more than what I really was. Okay, that's an example of the contrast effect. Okay? It's definitely a bias that we tend to fall into, and many of us can be guilty of that. When that happens, no persuasion occurs, right? We're not changing anybody's opinion when that occurs. Okay, on the other hand, we have something called the assimilation effect. The assimilation effect is kind of the opposite. It occurs when I hear a message that falls into my latitude of acceptance. And I think that message is even more close to my anchor position than it actually is. So I assume that message is more similar to my beliefs than what it actually is. Right? So if we stick with this issue of student loan debt, right? And again, let's imagine that your stance on the issue is that really college should be free, right? And you shouldn't have to take out loans for college tuition, right? And perhaps someone says something like, yeah, we have real problems in this country right now with student loans, and it's really interesting how other countries are able to provide free college. I didn't necessarily say there that I think the United States should have free college, right? I just said that we do have a problem. Other countries seem to have good solution. But maybe if the assimilation effect occurred, you heard me actually agreeing with you, right? What you heard me say was, oh yeah, I think college should be free in the US as well. So you can see that contrast effect and assimilation effect are kind of like kind of opposite biases. Finally, we have the boomerang effect, and we see this all the time, okay? So the boomerang effect occurs when someone makes a statement to try to persuade another, and what actually winds up happening is the recipient of the message moves farther away from the position that they're trying to be persuaded of, right? So I'm trying to convince you that student loan debt should be forgiven. And as I continue to talk, you hear what I'm saying, and you actually think, no, we need students, we need to raise tuition prices, right? So the boomerang effect is really like your message is backfiring, right? And if you've ever been in a conversation before where you're interacting with someone and they're talking to you and you just feel yourself engaging in that kind of silent arguing, and you feel yourself making arguments for your side as that other person is talking, I think it's pretty safe to say what you're experiencing there is the boomerang effect, right? Their message is actually making you even farther away from what they're trying to convince you of than how you felt before they even started speaking. Okay, so let's move on to one additional concept for the theory, and that is the idea of ego involvement. Social judgment argues that ego involvement is how relevant or how important an issue is to you. Right? So my guess is an issue like student loan forgiveness is really important to a lot of you, right? Especially any of you who currently have student loan debt, right? So you can say that you were highly ego involved in this issue. On the other hand, issues that may not be that important to you or may not be that relevant or salient in your life, those are issues where you are not very ego involved. You would have low ego involvement. Okay, so it's important to know what ego involvement is. But now we can go on to say the theory predicts that ego involvement does influence the ability to shift one's attitude. So if somebody is highly ego involved in an issue, like really invested in this topic, to be perfectly honest, what the theory says is it's going to be really hard to persuade that person. It's going to be very unlikely to get them to change their attitude. Someone who's highly ego involved in an issue is going to have a very small, if not non-existent, latitude of non-commitment, right? If I feel particularly strongly about an issue, then odds are there's going to be very few statements that you say to me that I say, I don't really care, or I see either way, right? Or I don't really know enough about it. That's probably not true, right? Either I'm going to agree or I'm going to disagree with the issue. Okay, so people who are highly involved have very small latitudes of non-commitment. People who are highly ego involved also tend to have very wide latitudes of rejection, right? So they tend to feel strongly about an issue that usually is an extreme position, and then everything else falls into their latitude of rejection, right? Or ideas that they would object to. Okay, so what can we do with all of this information, right? Well, social judgment theory really does attempt to offer a lot of practical advice for inducing attitude shifts. And the first one I have listed here, I think might be the most important thing to keep in mind. Social judgment would argue that when we're trying to persuade someone, attempts to understand another's position are actually much more effective than just simply stating our own position. And this is definitely another one of those things that falls into that category of easier said than done. More often than not, when we are trying to persuade someone, our habit is to, as I said at the very beginning of this lecture, state our case, provide our arguments, offer a laundry list of evidence and arguments, and assume that that should be enough to logic the other person into our side. But what we know is, especially if the other person is very highly ego involved in an issue, just simply stating our side of the issue and restating that issue over and over again does very little to actually persuade others. If you don't take anything else from this lecture or the module this week, I just want to offer you one suggestion and challenge you to try to do one thing. And that is, the next time you find yourself trying to persuade or influence another person, whether it is a coworker at work or a friend or a family member, my challenge to you is catch yourself when you attempt to start the conversation by simply stating your case. Take a moment, pause, take a breath, and ask that person 2 questions first. Okay. The questions are probably going to be kind of context specific, but essentially take a moment to ask something about, now, how do you feel on this issue? Or why do you feel that way? Right? Give them the opportunity to tell you a little bit more about their attitude. It's hard to do, but social judgment theory tells us that if the more we can learn about the attitude of the person we are interacting with, then the better we can craft our messages to persuade that person. Right? It's really hard to figure out how to get that individual to kind of come closer to our side until we first know what their stance is and why they have the position that they do. And so again, if you don't take anything else from today or from this lecture, that's my suggestion to you. And I would love to hear you guys write about that in your discussions or your application essays. The next time you're trying to influence someone, just try it out. Just see what happens if you bite your tongue, and rather than just jumping in with your side of the issue, ask that person a few questions. Okay. I'll be looking forward to seeing what happens. Okay, we have some other advice that social judgment theory gives us, though. Right. The next idea is that even though it's not very satisfying, and sometimes, frankly, it's frustrating, the truth is large shifts in attitude usually only take place very gradually. You are not going to shift somebody's mind regarding any issue in which they have any ego involvement in from one extreme to the other in a single conversation. Right? In my classes, I like to give the example regarding motorcycle safety and specifically wearing motorcycle helmets because that happens to be one issue that my husband and I have very differing viewpoints on. He grew up riding motorcycles his whole life. We grew up in Indiana. In Indiana, there were no laws regarding having to wear a helmet. I have only been on a motorcycle like twice my whole life and perceive them to be much more dangerous than he does. Right? So we have very different opinions. I think I don't know if you should ever ride a motorcycle, but if you do, you absolutely should have a helmet. He really doesn't think helmets are necessary and might even argue that helmets cause more problems than solutions. Okay, so the reality is neither one of us are going to flip-flop our positions just through 1 or 2 conversations. Frankly, neither one of us has changed our positions over multiple years, right? Shifts in attitude take place very slowly and very gradually. So although that is frustrating and it is not a satisfying concept, I think the takeaway message there is, pat yourself on the back. Appreciate little successes if you find yourself making kind of incremental shifts in the attitude of the person that you are trying to persuade, right? Celebrate those kind of minor victories. Okay, we've got a few more pieces of advice from the theory. Third, we have choose a message within the latitude of acceptance, but for maximum change, try to pick a message that is as far away from that person's anchor position as possible, right? Basically what that's saying is, again, You need to know what the person you're interacting with attitudes are towards the issue. You need to know where they stand. And you need to avoid sharing messages with them that fall into their latitude of rejection. Because if you do that, they're just going to turn you out, right? They're not going to listen. And in fact, maybe worse, they may boomerang over farther away from your stance. Okay? But instead, for the most success, right, the maximal change, figure out kind of what are ideas that they tend to agree with, figure out where their primary anchor position is, and then get them to, or make sure that you share messages that still fall within that latitude of acceptance. So messages that they tend to agree with, but maybe don't personally hold, but kind of push them over. Right? That's the best that you can hope for. And along with that, the next item suggests that sometimes ambiguity is actually more effective than clarity. Right? I think that sometimes sounds a little counterintuitive, right? In a communication course, we talk a lot about the importance of being clear and concise and precise with our words. But sometimes it can be beneficial to be a little bit vague. Right? Maybe you've heard the term strategic ambiguity before. Maybe you've sent out emails before that were strategically ambiguous, right? When you're ambiguous, then what happens is you can put out a somewhat vague message, and your audience can interpret that message. And if the person you're interacting with likes you, you have positive rapport with that person, right? As Cialdini points out, those things are going to go a long way to, kind of lead that person to a more positive interpretation of what you're saying, right? I see a lot of this when it comes to kind of debating deadlines and timelines for projects, right? Although sometimes that can lead to some frustration down the road, but by making statements about change happening soon or change happening in the near future, these are kind of ambiguous terms that maybe everyone can get behind, even if everyone doesn't specifically agree on the exact time frame. Okay. Let me share the next one with you and then try to kind of wrap it up with an example I recently saw in one of my undergraduate classes that I think does a really nice job of highlighting both the good and the bad attempts, these strategies. But the last suggestion from social judgment theory is that members of the same reference group are often more persuasive than those who are not part of the same reference group. And for this one, I think the best way to think about that is to think about politics, right? Think of a scenario where you hear a message from someone who is kind of a part of the same political party that you are, versus you hear a message from someone who is in a different political party from you, right? Typically what happens is you are much more likely to agree with and to instantly like the message you hear from the person from the same political party, right? Even if you aren't really processing or thinking through what they're saying. In fact, there's been some interesting studies out there where the researchers manipulate who the message is coming from, but leave the message the same. And if I am a Democrat and I think the message came from a Democrat, I am much more likely to say I agree with it, versus if I am a Republican and I think the message came from a Democrat, even if the message is the exact same. Right? So this last piece of advice from social judgment theory really is closely linked to the things that you are reading about from Cialdini's book, right? It really is related to the power of liking as well as the power of that influence lever of social proof, right? We really rely heavily on those cues when we are trying to interpret messages and even weigh those messages to our attitudes. Okay, well, I'm going to wrap things up here soon, but let me give you one example that hopefully does kind of tie in all of these different suggestions for inducing attitude shifts. So in my undergraduate class, we have recently been talking about persuasion, and the class participated in kind of a large conversation regarding a couple of current events. And one of the current events that came up was the issue of Antonio Brown. I don't know if you guys are big football fans or not, or really know who Antonio Brown is, but he is or he was a player in the NFL. He was on the Tampa Bay Bucks. And a few weeks ago, he had, I guess what's being referred to as kind of an incident on the field, right? He took off all of his jerseys and paddings and basically quit right in the middle of the game and ran off the field, right? People had instant reactions to that behavior. right? And essentially it ranged from kind of Antonio Brown is a jerk to Antonio Brown is a victim, right? And has mental health issues that should be addressed, right? So anyway, in my class, this issue came up and there was a really interesting conversation. There were people all over the spectrum. People had a wide variety of attitudes regarding their opinions on Antonio Brown. There were a few people in the class that definitely believed Antonio Brown is a jerk, right? And cited several reasons why they felt that way. On the other hand, there were people in the class who believed that Antonio Brown may have brain injuries and may be a victim of or maybe being exploited by the NFL, and we're way over here on this side, right? So what was fascinating to watch in this conversation is that in the initial reaction, not surprisingly, was that the people who were the most ego involved and the most interested in this topic just went at it, right? They did what we just say we have a tendency to do. They just stated their own opinions and went back and forth. And this side offered lots of reasons why Antonio Brown is a jerk, right? And cited previous history and previous teams, and offered instances of his behavior being inappropriate already. This side cited examples of other people who had brain injuries and referred to issues related to mental health and so on, right? There was zero conversation transcending the other side, right? There was no shift in attitude, at least what I could perceive from the people on the extremes. Interestingly enough, at one point, two classmates really got involved. They were less, I think, ego involved in the issue, right? So they were able to have wider areas of non-commitment. So I think that's part of what enabled them to be able to step into the conversation and ask questions, right? Not just state their claims, right? And I think it was a real light bulb moment when one of the questions that came up was, and she herself is a student athlete at SVSU, and the question was, do you think that coaches and or teams ever exploit their players in order to gain profit? And just simply asking that question and getting kind of really everyone along the continuum to say, well, yeah, we think that happens, completely shifted the argument, right? And it changed the entire nature of the conversation, right? So I encourage you to think about that, right? I encourage you, the next time you are in this conversation, think about how you can pause and what can you do to really try to better understand the attitude of the person you're interacting with. Because as you now know, social judgment says the best route to influence is to crafting a message that that the person you're trying to influence can't agree with, yet pushes them over just a little bit. Okay, some of the exercises that you are going to be doing for this module hopefully also help you to continue to think about that. You'll see that the first exercise actually gives you the opportunity to fill out a scale and to actually see your different latitudes regarding an issue. And then related to that, the second part of the exercise asks you to think about, well, how would you craft messages that fall into the different latitudes of another person? And so, yeah, hopefully you're able to carry these lecture slides with you as you work on that exercise. I think I'll wrap things up at this point, but as always, if you have any questions about this material or anything else that goes on in this module, please don't hesitate to reach out. All right, guys, have a great week.